Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Amanda McWhirt. I'm a fruit and vegetable extension specialist at the University of Arkansas, and today I'm going to talk about muscadine fertility management. Muscadines are pretty vigorously growing vines and really don't need a lot of excessive fertility compared to some of our other specialty crops. But we do want to make sure that we're providing enough nutrients so that the plants are able to produce a good quality crop without applying too much nitrogen in particular, where we might get excessive growth that then results in a lot of new shoots and canes that are in the way of our harvest practices or resulting in not really good air movement around the crop. Another unique thing about muscadines is that muscadines are really a southern crop, and so they do tend to be pretty cold sensitive once temperatures get below about 10 degrees. And so previous work has shown that if we are putting on too much nitrogen too late in the season, we can actually make the plants more susceptible to cold injury. So there are some unique things that we need to discuss about how to manage fertility in muscadines. So what are some of the things that can impact fertility management in muscadines? There's a few things that we need to keep in mind. So soil pH is going to be one of the biggest drivers of fertility management, and it's going to be something that you've probably already heard about during site selection talks, but I'm also going to talk a little bit more about it here in this presentation. Another thing that can impact fertility just in general for all crops is soil texture. So if a soil is more sandy, it's going to tend to be a little less fertile than a soil that is heavily clayey. So keeping in mind your soil texture and the natural fertility levels there can be important in determining kind of the rates that you may need in order to produce a good muscadine crop. By the same token, soil organic matter content, soil organic matter as it breaks down does release nutrients, and so a soil that is more highly organic is going to be naturally more fertile than a soil that has very low organic matter content. Additionally, plant age is going to be really important for keeping in mind how much fertility the crop needs. So a young planting is not going to need as much fertility as an established planting that is producing a full crop. Additionally, we might want to keep in mind our application methods. So if we are putting out our fertility through the drip in a fertigation situation, that's a really highly efficient method of applying fertilizer, and so we may be able to apply a lower rate than if we're broadcasting our fertility across an entire field, and some of that fertility may be being intercepted by the row middle cover or whatever is growing in the row middles, like your grass or any kind of plants there. And then finally, cultivar may have an impact on fertility management. So some cultivars may need a higher rate of fertility than others. And this is something that a lot of research is still being done on in the Southeast, but something to keep in mind as you move forward with different cultivars in your planting. So let's first talk about soil pH. The reason why soil pH is important for fertility management is that we know that as pH changes from acid being somewhere around 4 all the way up to 10, where it would be a more basic soil, that impacts the availability of nutrients in the soil. And it has different impacts on nutrients that we would consider macronutrients, so nutrients that are needed in large quantities, things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium, versus nutrients that are needed in small quantities that we refer to as micronutrients, so things like iron, manganese, boron, copper, and zinc, and molybdenum. And if you look at this graph here, you can see that the width of the different bars that have the labels for different nutrients on them change in how big that bar is at different pHs. What you'll notice is that most of these macronutrients, nutrients that are needed in large quantities, that bar gets bigger as the pH starts to get closer to around 7. Whereas for the micronutrients, a lot of those bars tend to get a lot bigger and wider as the pH gets lower, so somewhere around 4 or 5. And the width of that bar is just an indication of how available that nutrient is at each pH. And for muscadines, we're looking at an ideal pH somewhere around 6 to 7. And between those pHs, and really 6.5 to 7 is even more ideal, but because of reasons we'll talk about here in a second, we put the range at between 6 and 7. we see that most of those macronutrients, nutrients needed in large quantities, are pretty highly available. But once we start to get below that pH, you see that those macronutrients really start to tail off and become less available. So if we start off with a pH that is too low, already some of those nutrients that we're going to need to be supplying in pretty high quantities are not going to be really highly available to our muscadine crop. And so starting off from the very beginning with getting your soil pH corrected before we plant is going to be key, because that's really your chance where you can go out and apply lime if you need to raise the soil pH to within that range of 6.5 to 7, and really get it tilled into the soil and let that material start to have an impact on soil pH before we plant. But of course, soil pH in the Southeast tends to be pretty highly acidic, and that native soil pH, like what we see here on this graph, will start to take over time, and you'll see that that pH will start to drift back down even if you have limed. And so we do need to monitor soil pH even after we planted by pulling regular soil samples, just to see if further lime needs to be applied. But again, the easiest way to amend soil pH is before we plant, where we can actually till that material in. After we planted, we're just going to be broadcasting the material across the soil surface. So soil testing is going to be really important to monitoring pH prior to establishment and then after we establish the crop. But soil testing also gives us some information about some of the other nutrient contents in the soil, and that can be helpful for when we're determining the rates of nutrients that we're going to apply subsequently. Current recommendations do suggest pulling soil samples from 2 different depths, so from 0 to 6 inches and from 6 to 12 inches after establishment, just to kind of see the stratification of nutrients in those 2 different layers and monitor changes in pH and nutrient content there. Once we kind of know something about soil pH and the nutrient content of our soils, then we can start thinking about, okay, we have plants in the ground, and how are we going to fertilize and supply the nutrients that those plants need based off of the information we got from our soil tests. And I want to break this down and talk about applying fertility to both young vines and then later mature vines, and break it down into talking about the rate, the method in which we're going to apply fertility, and then also the timing, because these 3 kind of components can be very important to making sure that we're applying the correct amount of fertilizer in a way that the plants can take it up, and then also at a time when the plants need that nutrient. So a general recommendation for young vines is plants that have just gone into the ground in the late spring, that you're going to apply maybe about 1 ounce of balanced fertilizer, something like a triple 10 or triple 12 per vine, with a goal of applying around 13 to 23 pounds of nitrogen per acre over the first season. And the way that you would do that is take that 1 ounce of fertilizer and spread it in an 18-inch circle around the base of the plant. You don't want that fertilizer applied any closer to the base of the vine, because you may get some burning. And the timing would be that we would apply that fertilizer in a few weeks after initial planting, so about 4 weeks after initial planting, and then repeating that application every 4 to 6 weeks through early August in that first year. And again, with the goal of applying a total of around 13 to 23 pounds of nitrogen per acre in that first year. And then the second year, we can slowly increase that rate to something maybe closer to about 2 ounces per vine, again, following a similar schedule. Of course, when we're applying this fertilizer, we also want to make sure that sufficient irrigation or rainfall is occurring, so that that's going to move that fertilizer into the rooting zone, and also so that the plant is maintained at a good irrigated status so that it can maximize growth and we don't get any kind of burning from a high fertilizer rate that is not fully dissolved in with enough water. Once the plants start to become mature vines, so generally about year 3, we would expect that we're going to start seeing a crop. Then the rate can increase quite a bit, because then we're also not only just growing the vine, we're also growing the crop, so the fruit that's going to be harvested. And of course, once we start producing fruit, we're then also removing a lot of nutrients from the field when we harvest. So on mature vines, somewhere between 40 to 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre is our recommended rate, and that phosphorus and potassium rates can then be modified based off of the testing of soils and also leaf nutrient testing that we'll talk about here in a second. Methods can vary quite a bit once the plants are established. Banding fertilizer down the weed-free strip alongside the vines, broadcast fertilizer, or even fertigation are all different methods. And of course, depending on your method and what you might have growing in your row middles, that may impact that rate that you see there. Of course, that rate from somewhere between 40 to 80 pounds is pretty wide. And that goes a lot back to what we talked about initially of what is your soil texture, what is your soil pH, what method are you using for applying your fertilizer, etc. And also what cultivar may you be growing. And so some of these recommendations may be, you may be able to fine tune a little bit more by talking to your local cooperative extension offices and getting a better idea of what they recommend based off of experience in your region. Again, timing is going to start in mid-spring, around April, and then on mature vines, we're going to try and put out the majority of that fertility pretty early in the season. So probably about 50 pounds of that at bloom if we were going for an 80-pound total rate, and then another 30 pounds at fruit set, with the goal of getting out all of our fertility before the end of June, before we start to get into July, so that that fertility is going out pretty early and we're not going to increase the susceptibility of the vines to cold injury. Now, again, we've given some kind of general recommendations of wide ranges of rates that can be applied, but of course we're going to want to use what we're seeing actually out in the field to kind of monitor and see if we're hitting our targets. And there's two ways that we can do this. One is visual monitoring, actually just going out and looking and seeing, are the plants growing off well? Are we seeing any visual symptoms of excessive fertility or deficient fertility? And then also we can do leaf tissue sampling that will actually give us some hard numbers to look at. But let's first talk about actually going out and using what we're seeing as a way to monitor or modify our fertility rate. So one of the first things that we can do is we can go and look at the amount of new growth that we're getting in the season. Generally, we're looking for new canes to be produced that are about 3 feet in length. If we're seeing really excessive growth where we're getting more than 4 feet of growth, that's probably going to be an indication that we are applying too much nitrogen and that we need to reduce that rate by maybe somewhere around 20% in the next year and see if we can pull back on that so that we're not getting excessively long canes that are in the way if we're going through and mechanically harvesting or just normal hand harvesting practices. If by contrast we go out and we're seeing that our canes are really not that long and we have a very short internode length, and we're getting growth of less than 3 feet, maybe even seeing some yellowing on some of the older leaves in the planting, that may mean that we're not putting out enough nitrogen and maybe we need to increase that rate by 10 to 15% in the next year. Some other visual symptoms that we may see of possibly a boron deficiency would be seen by poor fruit set. Boron deficiency tends to be more common on sandy soils, and so that would be something that we would want to monitor. And if we suspect it with visual symptoms, we would also want to come back in and pull a leaf tissue sample just to confirm it, because boron is one that we don't want to over apply and we can get into a toxicity situation. But if it is deficient, then we can know going into the next season that we need to apply some boron around bloom with some foliar sprays or through the drip or some broadcast applications that you can do with borax or with Solubor. Another very common symptom that we might see out in the field is late season leaf margin yellowing, like you see in the picture on the right hand side. That's very common for all grape crops and it's indicative of a magnesium deficiency. And that can be rectified by applying some Epsom salts or another magnesium containing fertilizer. So first we can just use what we're seeing in the field, but the other more concrete way to monitor if we're putting out enough fertility is to do leaf tissue sampling. And this is something that we really recommend growers do on an annual basis, just to try and head off if there are any deficiencies starting to develop and get those rectified or taken care of before we actually see those visual symptoms in the field. And there's really two different times you can do sampling. The one that we currently recommend the most is to do bloom sampling. So we would go out and pull 60 to 80 leaf samples, so whole leaves where it's the leaf and the petiole. And collect those from a uniform area, so over a single cultivar or a single area that is being managed the same way or is of the same age, the same plant age. Those samples can then be sent into your local lab. So there are plant tissue nutrient analysis labs in several states across the Southeast. NCDA in North Carolina has one, the University of Arkansas has one, as well as several other states as well. And basically what you're going to do is pull those samples, send them into the lab, and they're going to be able to analyze them and tell you the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and other nutrients that are present. You can then take those samples, or you working with your local cooperative extension office can look at those recommended ranges that you see there on the right hand side and start to get a feel for if your crop is falling within our current recommended nutrient ranges for that time of sampling. And that's what's going to be really key is that you need to make sure that you're sampling at the correct time, because plants naturally will fluctuate in the amount of nutrient content they have at different phenological stages. And that will just kind of get you an idea of, are you falling within those ranges, or do you need to modify your fertility program in some way? There's also an opportunity to do a second sampling about 90 to 120 days after bloom, and then check in with the crop again. Again, there's different recommendations in different states across the Southeast, so contact your local cooperative extension service, and they can give you recommendations about what time of sampling is most recommended and the type of sampling. So if you're doing whole leaf samples with the leaf and the petiole, or if they are using different standards that require only using the leaf with the petiole separate. So thank you so much for your attention and this quick discussion of Muscadine fertility management. I look forward to answering any questions if you have them. Thanks so much.